part of our Building Peace series at the museum, and I'm happy to say that every Sunday since January, I've been running about 70 people coming on a Sunday afternoon once a month to hear about different ways we can build peace. And it's really my honor today. My name is Kathy Rao. I'm a professor of sociology at Sinclair, but I also happen to be vice chair of the Peace Museum Board. And I can tell you that increasingly it's a really exciting place to be. We're doing really great work. And as you can see, we're gathered in an amazing room where we have quilts that were donated to us. They represent the golden rule in every religion around the world. And I hope that after today, the museum's open till 5. If you've not seen some of our exhibits, you will come by. But I want to make sure that we have time to hear our speaker, who was kind enough to drive all the way down from Granville, Ohio today. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce, and I've been told that I'm not allowed to read his bio, so I will not. You told me no big introduction. I was preparing because I think the world of this person, but I will not do that. He said, please Google him or whatever, and you can read it. He also has, he's been interviewed on TV a few times. He has some really great videos. And it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. He is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and doing really amazing work in the world. And if you do Google him, you'll see that he's speaking a lot. In fact, I really liked your recent talk, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, on minimum wage. So he also is not just doing work in sustainable development, but speaks on various issues of poverty as well that I've really appreciated reading and using in my classes. So without further ado, I'll have our speaker come up and introduce himself.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. What I want to talk about today is the Arab Uprisings, and notice I'm not using the popular term the Arab Spring, because by now I think most of us realize there was really no spring to speak of, especially when we look at the situation in Syria and Yemen and other places. I want to make the connection between climate change and some of the popular uprisings that happen in the Middle East, especially in Syria, and make the point that I'm not trying to say that climate change is what caused the uprisings per se, but climate change is one of the elements that amplified the political and social and economic tensions that were already building up in that part of the world and other places around the world. And the lesson for us, sitting here in the Dayton International Peace Museum, is to realize that the issue of climate change is not just a political question that people in DC are arguing about, or climate deniers are arguing about back and forth. It's a question of life and death. It's a question of war and peace, and that's why I wanted to make this connection for us. So without any further ado, I love this image from the New York Times, kind of representing essentially what I've been thinking about, which is droughts and the effects of climate change on these popular uprisings. I want to start with this. Hopefully it will animate in a second. Just kind of global temperature change data. It's going to stop in December 2016. That's the most recent that I've been able to get. And notice how quickly it starts to accelerate in the last few years. If I let it play one more time, it will do it one more time. Notice the 1.5 degrees Celsius is the limit that scientists are telling us. If we exceed that, we're really into dangerous territory, and we're already at the edge of that limit. The outer bound, which is the 2 degrees Celsius. This is December 2016. We're probably even closer today as we speak to that limit. Once we break those limits, it's really a point of no return. So the urgency of climate action is just undeniable. Yet there are people who still feel it's somewhat a political issue, that science has nothing to do with kind of pushing us in the right direction. This is data for CO2 emissions, kind of going, hundreds of thousands of years, and then this is our recent time. We're getting to the 400 limit, which again, scientists tell us that these are points of no return, that urgency for climate action is not a question of politics, it's a question of life and death, war and peace, as I argue today. So this issue has been on people's mind for a long time, including governments at the international level. So governments around the world got together and decided, okay, we need to do something about this, carbon emission. We need to budget how much we can pollute globally, and get nations to commit to reducing their carbon emissions. So this is a picture of the carbon budget that the U.S. has, the European Union, China, and then the rest of the world, which is mostly developing countries. And we're not even, there's no way we can make it, right? I hate to say it, unless we take drastic actions, kind of World War II scale type of investment, not in war effort, but in climate change war on climate change, essentially. Converting to newer technologies that are available and are becoming cheaper by the day. Solar, wind, geothermal, changing the way we do public transportation, changing the way we consume food in particular. Instead of eating salads that are trucked through continents 3,000 miles, more local and sustainable food production. These are the dramatic changes that we have to adjust to very quickly if we are looking at continuing life on this planet in the future. And this is really the sad part of this story, that the science is there, the evidence is there, but the technology is there. This is the amazing thing. The resources are there, and we're just waiting to see what happens. And this is not the kind of thing we should wait on. So zooming in on the Middle East, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this is the first thought, just to make sure that nobody leaves from here and says that I said that the Arab Springs was caused by climate change. What I'm saying is that climate change does not automatically cause wars, but it can contribute to amplifying already existing social tensions, economic dislocation, and ethnic divisions that often lead to armed conflicts. And this is essentially my point about the situation in Syria in particular, to some extent Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen as well. And I'll get to those details in a minute. So those of you following the news about the Middle East or know a little bit about the Middle East, we're talking about one of the most water-stressed regions in the world. Significant droughts throughout history, but these droughts are getting much more severe in recent years and are getting longer, and their effects on people are becoming much more substantial. The heat waves, every summer we hear about new records, and I'll show you some of the data in a little bit. Deforestation, desertification, all of these effects on food production are extremely important for economic stability and for social stability. That builds up to political tension, obviously, and loss of biodiversity because of pollution and because of the loss of forest and the loss of green space and clean air and all of these things. It's about clean air, it's about clean water, it's about land pollution. All of these things amplify the effects that we've looked at the global level. Think of these as much more severe in the Middle East than most other parts of the world. These are just a few slides from some of the recent records, heat wave records in the Middle East that are becoming unbearable in the last 2 summers in particular. And people in the Middle East are used to hot weather, but not this kind, right? This is unheard of in the history of the region, in the history of the world. This is Fahrenheit. So scientists are talking about in the next 50 years, this part of the world will become uninhabitable during the summer months. People literally have to move out, can only come back during the cooler season.
Wow.
And this is within my kid's lifetime. People are not going to be able to live in that part of the world. And it's not forecasting 500 years, it's forecasting, and this is assuming, things stay the way they are, things don't get worse. Obviously, if things get worse, these estimates are telling us that these problems are coming to us much sooner than we expect. These are some of the images of the region in the summer. This picture here shows global water stress data. So the darkest red are the most water stressed regions. The data is not perfect because it gives you overall regional or country-based water stress, but when you zoom in and look at regional within particular countries, the data is much worse in terms of water stress. So this last summer, Tunisia was going through a drought to the point where the government started to shut off water completely on the interior part of the country, up to 2 weeks of very little amount of water allowed, because the dams were already empty. And they were 3 or 4 days away from starting to shut down water on the capital and the coastal areas, which is where most of the population is. And thankfully it started to rain and the water came back. But they were literally 3 days away from a major political, economic, social, humanitarian situation. That's how bad it is. In the literally this last summer. I'm talking about the rain came in September and kind of saved the country from another disaster. This is the World Bank, not the most progressive organization when it comes to this kind of stuff, estimating the cost of environmental degradation. This is just purely the economic cost. We're not talking about the humanitarian, the quality of life, all the other things. There's just, dollars basically. And they break down the estimate based on the cost of, water and air and land pollution and that kind of stuff. And it's just from a pure economic standpoint, wasting 6, 7, 8% of GDP because of these effects is also unsustainable. So the science is there, the economics is there, the quality of life indicators are there. What are we waiting for?
Is that per year? Those are
this is annual estimates. Yeah. Zooming in on particular water issues in the region, because this is again a water-stressed region with historical conflicts that were already started because of water scarcity. So thinking of the River Jordan and its significant importance for Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Israel, that whole region essentially fed by one source, and the conflict over controlling that resource for water and also for electricity production. It's not just water, it's a source of life, it's a sort of economic growth, it's a sort of source of political dominance too. Shatt al-Arab River, which is the river that comes down between Iraq and Iran. The Euphrates River eventually, pours in there, and it's a very short. When I show you the map, maybe I think it's the next picture. This is the River Jordan, so I'll come back to Iraq and Iran. It builds essentially the border between Jordan and Palestine, West Bank, Israel. The Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is the final destination, but it starts from Lebanon with a bunch of smaller rivers and smaller streams that make up eventually the River Jordan. When it comes to Shatt al-Arab, which is this picture is small, so it's this teeny strip here that makes the border eventually between Iraq and Iran, and was the source of that conflict. A very bloody war between Iraq and Iran. Not only because of the water, because of other issues, obviously, but the water issue was a big part of it. And then the third and still ongoing sort of conflict is the River Nile, which is shared mostly by Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. I'll show you the map here. So the source obviously starts from here, but then once you get to Sudan and Egypt, the river flows in this direction, by the way. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So when you build dams, when you interrupt the flow of the river, the country that suffers the most is going to be Egypt, which is its only source of water, essentially, is for irrigation and for agriculture and for all kinds of things, and for electricity production. Egypt sees it as a declaration of war, essentially. And when Ethiopia in the past tried to build a dam, the Egyptian Air Force didn't think twice. They just flew F-16s or whatever they had at the time and destroyed it. Ethiopia is now in the process of building a new one anyway. So there's some negotiations, there's some discussions about how we're going to share this resource in a sustainable way. But it's a very, very tricky situation, because if you build a dam, you're going to divert water, you're going to reduce the water flow. It's going to affect you, and it's a source of supporting agriculture and supporting the whole country. So these issues are extremely serious. Again, they're already serious, and now add on top of it the effects of climate change and the effects that global warming has on rivers and agriculture and water stress. It just makes it much more tense as a source of amplifying conflicts. The situation in Syria that most people are familiar with, I'm going to recap the sad parts of this. By now, probably more than 400,000 people killed, more than 5 million refugees, 11 million internally displaced within the country in very, very precarious conditions. Massive infrastructure destruction in terms of schools and hospitals and public services that affect the quality of life, obviously. Public health in particular is a massive disaster. And the UN and humanitarian organizations are asking for, upwards of $7-8 billion just to deal with the refugee situation, just to deal with providing clean water and food and medicine to people who are displaced. And we're not even close to those numbers in terms of actual commitments from the international community. So this is where we are today. The part that most discussions about the Syrian conflict typically ignore is what happened 5 years before the conflict. Before there was even a thing called the Arab Spring or uprisings or anything like that. It's the drought that displaced millions of people before the conflict even started. And it was one of the most severe droughts in the history of Syria. From 2006 to 2011, 3 million people were affected by the drought before the Arab uprisings. 1 million people experienced food insecurity, meaning people don't know where their next meal is going to come from. Shortages of food. 1.5 million people were displaced from rural areas because their livelihood was destroyed by the drought, moved to urban cities. And you can imagine, the overcrowding, the stress on resources, water resources, food resources, schools and hospitals. That builds social instability and political instability. That already happened before the conflict. Syria was a proud kind of self-sufficient food producer, and that was the strategy of the country for a long time. And this drought essentially broke that long history of food self-sufficiency. Agricultural yield declined by 32% in the irrigated areas, and the areas that depended on rainfall declined by 80% during this drought. And that pushed Syria into becoming a net importer of wheat, which is a major food staple, obviously, for Syria and for the Middle East in general. And that has severe economic consequences that I'll come back to at the end. Moving to a net importer of food type of situation can have dramatic inflationary effects on the economy.
What's the total population in the world?
20 some. Yeah, don't quote me on the exact number. Yeah, 20 some for sure. agricultural production fell from 25% of GDP in 2003 to 17% of GDP in 2011. This is before the conflict again. So the economic effect of the drought led to that displacement of the population, the stress on water resources, food resources, and then the inflationary effect of importing food from abroad, importing it at inflated global prices, much more expensive global prices, led to further economic stress and tension that the government was simply not able to handle. Right? So that's part of the story that's often untold. Again, I'm not ignoring the democracy issues, the human rights issues. I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking purely about the economic effect of climate change and how that amplified the political tension in the country. Livestock in Syria declined by 85%, wiped out during that drought. And that's what explains why 1 million people live with food insecurity. That explains why 1.5 million people gave up their livelihood, their land, their homes, and moved to the cities. There's just nothing left. Right? And that increase in put more pressure on urban and rural poverty, unemployment, and that negative feedback effect that these kind of situations create. So again, it's not the thing that caused the Arab Spring to happen, but you can think of it as a major effect that amplified already existing political tensions and social tensions, just made them much, much worse, and led to that moment of political explosion, or whatever you want to call it. Another story that's often ignored, especially in the Western media, in Western political debates about the Syrian conflict in particular, which is not directly related to climate change, but it's related to the kind of the race for resources. And in this case, it's not oil. In this case, it's natural gas, which is a major resource that Russia and Qatar in particular control, being the largest producers or the countries with the largest reserves. And I'm putting Iran there on the Russian side because Iran is also a major producer, but happens to be an ally of the Russian regime as opposed to Qatar and the rest of the Arab countries in the Gulf. So there's a rivalry there to have access to the largest markets and the largest consumers, which is the European market. And the question about natural gas is, you either build a pipeline and you directly deliver it to your consumers. That's the cheapest way to do it. Or you go the expensive route, which is what Qatar does, which is build these gigantic factories that liquefy natural gas, turn it into liquid, load it onto gigantic ships, and then ship it to consumers, and then turn it back into gas, from liquid to gas. Very expensive process, lots of shipping, lots of additional cost. The problem that Qatar has is that it doesn't have really easy access to building pipelines directly to Europe. Same thing with Iran, right? So they both have this massive resource, but they're just locked in there. Unless they can build a pipeline that cuts through the following countries, hence the conflict. So this is about 3, maybe not even 4 weeks before the conflict started in Syria. Maybe 4 weeks. I have to go back and check the dates. A delegation from Qatar goes to meet with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, high-level delegation, with a proposal to build a pipeline. This is Qatar here. The blue pipeline that will cut through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and then from Syria connect to the Turkish natural gas network, and then from Turkey into Europe. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But notice that, Saudi Arabia, not a problem. Jordan, not a problem. It has to go through Syria and then Turkey, right? The Syrian government at the time said, you know what, sorry, we can't do that because last week we just agreed with the Iranians that we'll be building their pipeline that goes from Iran. This is where most of their natural gas is offshore in this area. And then through Iraq, and then through Syria, and then underwater pipeline that connects to Europe through Greece and the rest of the European network. So it avoids both Turkey and it avoids Saudi Arabia. So this is sort of what some people refer to as the Shiite crescent or whatever, which sort of makes sense, right? So the alliance is very different. There is a very clear division between who are your friends and who are your foes when it comes to these kind of things. That's why Turkey flipped right away. Turkey and Syria had very friendly relations. Just a few days before the conflict, the picture flipped. And that's why you immediately see a massive support by the Qatari government in particular to the rebels, to the opposition, right? Because it's really for a country that exclusively depends on exports of natural gas. It's a question of life and death. It's not a question of, okay, we lost this business deal, we'll get another one. It is the only business deal, right? So it is another major source of this tension.
Which is the better economic alternative? The one from Iran to Europe or Qatar to Turkey?
I'll tell you the better economic
Yeah,
alternative.
because it's very long to me.
I'll go back to the picture. You see all this heat, all this sun? This is the better alternative. It's renewable energy. It's not oil, it's not natural gas, it's not building pipelines, it's not fueling more conflicts. It's using the technology that we already have to produce all the energy that we want in the world. 1 hour of sunlight a day is enough to produce electricity for the entire globe. Just 1 hour. That's what the data says.
For one day of the globe's energy needs.
Yeah, for 1 day. So 1 hour a day is enough to produce everything. So it's not about is it oil or is it natural gas, which one is cleaner, which one will kill us faster or slower. It's which is the better option. We have the technology, we have the resources, we have the sunlight. This is the part of the world that has it the most, right? But for whatever reason, we are where we are today. Right? So you have, these are the key players when it comes to the natural gas pipeline, but there's a whole bunch of other countries surrounding this area that want to jump on board with this because they too have some natural gas, and it's convenient if a pipeline is built next to you, you just connect to it and you sell to the biggest consumer, which is Europe today. Lebanon, Israel discovered quite a bit of stuff offshore. There's this disputed area between Lebanon and Israel. Now who's going to take it? It's another source of conflict over this, because once the pipeline is built, whether through Syria or somewhere else, it becomes cheap for Lebanon or for Israel to connect to it. There's also the existing Arab pipeline, which is the Egyptian portion of the pipeline. This is called the Arab pipeline that connects Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. Pretty quick to connect through the first pipeline or the second pipeline, which is again why you saw Egypt in the beginning sort of hesitating, which side are we on? It doesn't really matter as long as somebody builds a pipeline, you can connect to it. And there's that tension between the early, the post-Mubarak sort of uprisings, with the Muslim Brotherhood siding with one side, and then now with the Sisi regime flipping to the other side. It's part of this story is also about the pipeline and access to a huge market, the European market. The Russians are extremely interested in this, obviously, because they dominate the global market as the largest producer. They dominate the European market. And the Europeans and the United States would like to see the Russian influence diminish. So they're very dependent on Russian oil, on Russian natural gas. So if you have the Qatari plan implemented, the Russian influence will diminish, and that's good for the United States, right? If you have the Iranian pipeline implemented, that's good for the Russians and that's not so good for U.S. influence and U.S. interest in Europe. So now it's a global thing. It's not just the local, 2 or 3 countries trying to build this and benefit from it. This is a global issue. There's sorry, that's an extra picture showing the direction of the pipeline. So now about a little bit of discussion about the non-oil economies in the Middle East, and I'll close with this. This is my closing slide, but to bring us full circle a little bit to some of the economic issues and how these can be extremely destabilizing. So when you have countries that have structural trade deficit, countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, for example, Lebanon, when you look at why they have a structural trade deficit, there's usually 2 items. It's food and oil. Everything else is fine. It's kind of balanced. You export and you import certain things, but the things that really drive your economy down is importing too much energy that you can't produce locally, and importing too much food that you can't grow locally. And these things are going to get worse, right? With climate change, with declines in agricultural yields in the region, with more droughts, it's not going to get any better. So you can imagine the food deficit in the Middle East growing in the next few years, in the next 3 decades. Energy deficits, there's the bad side of it, which is if you're dependent on energy imports, you have to import them. The more transportation you have, the more economic activity you have, the more you have to import, unless you invest massively in renewable energy, and you can sort of avoid that problem. But the effects in general for having a large trade deficit is a devaluation of your currency. So you can imagine the Egyptian pound, and we've seen it already in the last couple of years, the Egyptian pound devalued dramatically relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And that devaluation means that the next morning when somebody from Egypt is trying to buy wheat or corn or anything from the rest of the world, it's going to buy it with a cheaper currency, which means it's going to cost them more. So when you have a trade deficit, you'll be importing inflation. And when you import food inflation and fuel inflation, you have food riots and fuel riots and all kinds of political instability. So once again, climate change puts stress on agriculture, puts stress on resources within the country, translates into food inflation, fuel inflation, translates into economic instability, political instability, social instability. This effect is not going to go away unless we address the 2 root causes of this trade deficit, which is food production. You can do that with local, sustainable production, and there's quite a bit of advanced yet simple technologies like hydroponic food production. You can produce fish and fresh vegetables in every household and on every rooftop without having to transport it 3,000 miles away, without having to import it. And guess what? It creates jobs too, which is another bonus. So we do have the answers. The technology is available, the resources are available. It's not too late, but it will be too late if we just keep looking at this and not doing anything about it. In terms of energy imports, again, it's the region of the world that has the largest amount of resources when it comes to sunlight, when it comes to wind, when it comes to geothermal resources. It's just we're investing this much today because it's kind of cute new technology and it's fancy and it looks good on, when you put it on websites, when we should be investing on a massive large scale to completely dismiss fossil fuel production within the next couple of decades. The solutions are there, but for whatever reason, we're ignoring them. And I forgot to highlight these things, so I talk about energy deficits and food deficits, and this is sort of summarizing how the trade deficit leads to these problems. So when countries face that currency devaluation because they have a trade deficit, the immediate band-aid solution that their central bank will have is to borrow dollars or euros from the outside world and to artificially intervene to lift up their exchange rate. That's the band-aid solution. And that means more external debt, more debt from the World Bank, from the IMF, from whoever is willing to lend those countries. And that comes with political strings attached with economic strings attached. So you lose your economic sovereignty. And in some cases, political sovereignty too, when you're controlled by outside institutions. So again, the loss of political stability, social stability, the loss of economic sovereignty, the loss of political sovereignty is amplified by the effects of climate change. And none of this is good, not for the countries of the region, not for the rest of the world. So the only way out, as I mentioned, I want to highlight it here in closing, renewable energy policy, sustainable agricultural policy, water management policy, conservation policy. These are the things that help us fight climate change. They just so happen to be the things that also help us produce peace in the region, better quality of life for people in the region, and prosperity, because these things happen to create a lot of jobs, new kinds of jobs that are not being destroyed by trade and outsourcing, all kinds of stuff. So thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.